The afternoon had the soft, hazy light that comes near the end of autumn, when the sun feels tired but kind. It was one of those days where the air carried just a hint of chill, but the light pouring through the windows still painted everything in a gentle, honey-colored glow. I was standing at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, finishing the last of the breakfast dishes that somehow had lingered into mid-afternoon. The warm water, the faint scent of lemon soap, the rhythmic clink of ceramic against stainless steel, those little rituals always calmed me more than I admitted. That's when I heard the sound of tires rolling slowly over the stones in our driveway. At first, I didn't think much of it. Our street was quiet, but every so often a delivery truck or a neighbor's car would wander past. Still, something about that particular sound made me glance up. Through the kitchen window, I saw a car pull in and stop near the porch. Familiar, but not one I saw every day. My husband Daniel had mentioned earlier in the week that his business partner might swing by at some point with some files and contracts. No set time, he'd said casually, buttoning his shirt that morning. If he comes, he comes. Don't fuss. He's easy. And now, apparently, sometime had chosen today. The car door opened and out stepped Adrian. I'd seen him many times before, mostly at company dinners, holiday gatherings, and the occasional charity event where spouses were kindly invited, but not truly needed. Around the office, from what Daniel said, Adrian had a reputation for being composed, thoughtful, steady in a way that calmed people. In person, he carried himself with a quiet confidence, never loud, never pushy, but with a kind of ease that made you instinctively relax when he walked into a room. I dried my hands on a dish towel and watched as Daniel opened the front door and greeted him. Their handshake had that unspoken history to it, a little extra grip, a shared laugh, a familiarity that said they'd been through long meetings and difficult deals together. As they exchanged a joke on the porch, their laughter drifted faintly back toward the kitchen, mixing with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking wall clock. I decided to meet them halfway, like I always did. I arranged a plate of cookies I'd baked earlier and poured cold drinks into tall glasses, balancing everything onto a tray. By the time I stepped into the living room, they were already seated, the sunlight slanting across the couch and catching the edge of the framed pictures on the wall. Our kids when they were smaller, vacations, birthdays, all the ordinary moments we'd frozen in time. Adrian turned when he heard me enter. His smile was warm, open, the kind that reached his eyes and made them crease slightly at the corners. "Smells good in here," he said lightly. "I'm guessing I came on the right day." I laughed and set the tray down on the coffee table. "It's just something I threw together earlier," I replied, even though I had spent a ridiculous amount of time perfecting that cookie recipe months ago. "Please, help yourself." At first, the conversation was easy and predictable. Work, upcoming projects, a client who had suddenly changed their mind about a proposal. I listened as they spoke. Daniel animated and focused, Adrian more measured, adding thoughts calmly and clearly. I'd heard pieces of their conversations before, always from a distance, and it struck me once again how well they balanced each other. Then Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "I have to take this. It's the supplier from Chicago, and if I don't answer, he'll panic." He stood up, pressing the phone to his ear. "Back in a few," he said, smiling at both of us before disappearing down the hallway toward his office. The house settled into a quieter rhythm, as if the air itself had exhaled. For a moment, Adrian and I simply listened to the faint murmur of Daniel's voice in the distance, the hum of the fridge, the soft whir of the ceiling fan. I reached for my glass, fighting the strange awareness that suddenly we were alone. He glanced slowly around the room, really seeing it in a way guests rarely do. His eyes paused on the books stacked neatly on the shelf, the small plant on the windowsill, the family pictures. He didn't rush to fill the silence, and oddly that made it less awkward. "Your home feels peaceful," he said eventually. "Lived in, but peaceful." "Thank you," I replied, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "I suppose I like having little routines, things in their place. It makes the days feel steady." He nodded, as if that made perfect sense to him. For a few seconds, I thought the conversation might slide back into talk about business. But something in his expression shifted. His shoulders relaxed, and his gaze grew distant, like he was looking at something far beyond the walls of our living room. "You know," he said quietly, "I didn't grow up in calm places like this." There was no dramatic pause, no heavy emphasis, yet his words settled between us with unexpected weight. I looked at him more closely, sensing that something deeper was unfolding. "My father," he continued, "was a man of rules more than warmth. The house was always orderly, strict, predictable, not in the comforting way. More like, if you stepped outside the line, you'd feel it." His eyes dropped to the glass in his hand. He believed that softness made people weak, so we were encouraged to be strong all the time. His voice didn't tremble, but there was a thread of something fragile woven through it, vulnerability, restrained but present. "I left as soon as I could," he went on. "College, then work. City after city, job after job, trying to prove something to myself, or to him, maybe both." He took a breath, letting it out slowly. "People always think traveling for work sounds exciting, but there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with never fully belonging anywhere. You learn to keep parts of yourself private, just to stay upright." I found myself leaning forward slightly, my hands folded loosely in my lap. I hadn't expected anything like this. I'd always placed him in a neat little category in my mind: Daniel's partner, competent and kind, pleasant to be around. That was where the story had ended. Now suddenly it felt like a door had opened. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "That sounds heavy, to carry that much pressure so young." He shrugged gently, but it wasn't a dismissive gesture, more like acceptance. "You get used to it," he said. "Or at least you think you do. You develop this persona, reliable, calm, the guy who can handle anything. People like that, they trust it, but it doesn't leave much room for being anything else." There was no self-pity in his voice, only an honest observation, the kind you make after years of thinking things through quietly. I hesitated for a moment before speaking. It felt strange to meet such openness with silence. "My mother passed away a few years ago," I said, the words coming more easily than I'd expected. "She was the softest person in the room wherever she went, the one everyone turned to because they knew she'd listen. When she died, people were kind. They brought flowers and casseroles. They said all the right words. But it was in the weeks after that the real emptiness settled in. The way her absence showed up in tiny things, an empty chair at the table, a recipe I couldn't quite replicate, moments where I instinctively reached for the phone and then remembered." Adrian's eyes met mine, and it felt like he really saw what I was saying, not just the surface of the story. "I think that's why I hold on to routines," I continued quietly. "Dishes, gardening, little rituals, they give shape to the spaces loss leaves behind." He nodded, a soft understanding in his expression. "I never learned how to be good with loss," he admitted. "With my father, it wasn't something we talked about. When his mother died, he just said, 'That's life,' and went back to work the next day. I think part of me confused being strong with shutting down." The silence that followed wasn't thick or uncomfortable. It was gentle, almost protective. Two people sitting in a sunlit room, acknowledging the weight of being human. The sound of Daniel's footsteps returning broke the moment, but in a way that felt natural, not intrusive. As he re-entered the living room, Adrian sent me a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that says, "Thank you for hearing that." I returned it with a faint nod, feeling oddly exposed yet strangely calm. The rest of the visit unfolded easily. They went back to discussing numbers and contracts, and I drifted back to the background, refilling glasses, offering more snacks, adding small comments here and there. But underneath it all, something had changed. I no longer saw Adrian solely as my husband's partner. I saw him as a person carrying his own history, his own unspoken stories. Later, when he got into his car and reversed out of our driveway, the sky was starting to blush with the muted colors of early evening. As I watched the car disappear down the quiet street, a warm, reflective stillness settled around me. I hadn't expected that kind of honesty from him. I hadn't expected to share any of my own either, yet I felt lighter somehow, as though a small, unseen window had been opened in a room I didn't know had grown stuffy. In the days that followed, life resumed its familiar pattern. Mornings with coffee at the kitchen table, errands, emails, laundry, Daniel's deadlines and conference calls. Yet there was a subtle shift in the way I moved through my days. I caught myself noticing things more sharply. The way the sunlight slid across the floor around 11 in the morning. The way the leaves scraped softly against the windows when the wind picked up. The particular quiet of the house in the early afternoon. Every so often, my thoughts drifted back to that conversation. Not to analyze it exactly, but to sit with it. The way his voice had softened when he talked about always needing to be strong. The way it had felt to speak honestly about my mother without having to minimize it for someone else's comfort. A week later, one evening after dinner, Daniel mentioned in passing, "By the way, Adrian might come by Friday. There's some paperwork we need to finalize. Don't feel like you have to hover. We'll probably just commandeer the dining table." I tried to respond casually. "Of course, I'll make sure it's clear for you." But inside there was a mix of something I couldn't immediately name, hesitation and curiosity woven together. Part of me wondered if that first conversation had been a one-time opening, something created by chance and timing, never to be repeated. Another part of me wanted to know more about the person who had sat on our couch and quietly laid out pieces of his inner life. Friday arrived under a blanket of heavy clouds. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that makes every color look slightly muted. I put a vase of fresh flowers, wild-looking ones with soft petals and thin stems, on the dining table, more out of habit than intent. The house hummed softly with its usual sounds, and as the clock edged toward late afternoon, I heard the now familiar crunch of tires in the driveway again. Adrian stepped in with a gust of cool air. He shook off a few stray drops of moisture clinging to his jacket, and immediately noticed the flowers. "Those are beautiful," he said genuinely. "They make the room feel brighter than the sky outside." I smiled, a little surprised at how natural it felt to have him there again. "They're from the little market on the corner," I told him. I couldn't resist them. Daniel greeted him, and for a while, the two of them spread papers and laptops across the table. Their conversation was focused, practical, rhythmic. I moved in and out of the room, refilling a bowl of fruit, topping off their drinks, trying not to linger but also not rushing myself away. At one point, Daniel's phone lit up on the table with an incoming call. He glanced at it, frowned slightly, then sighed. "I have to take this. It's the contractor about the warehouse renovation. He's impossible to catch otherwise." He gave us an apologetic look. 2 minutes, he said, though we both knew it would likely be longer, and stepped into the hall. Once again, the house eased into that softer quiet. This time, the silence didn't feel uncertain. It felt familiar, almost expected, like an old friend who had returned and settled into the same chair it had occupied before. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, letting his pen rest on the table. His eyes drifted to the window, where a faint stripe of light had managed to break through the clouds, just enough to cast a gentle glow on the glass. "I grew up in a small town," he said, the words dropping into the air as naturally as if we'd been in the middle of the thought already. "Not like this neighborhood exactly. More worn around the edges. But we had this little hill behind the house. In winter, it felt like the whole world shrank down to that hill and a few houses." I listened quietly, letting him find his own pace. "On the coldest nights, you could smell wood smoke from almost every chimney," he continued. "Kids would be inside fighting over blankets or board games. I remember standing at the kitchen window, watching the snowfall, feeling like time had slowed down just for us. My mother would hum when she cooked. Not songs I recognized, just little melodies she made up or carried from somewhere in her memories. It was the one place in the house that felt soft." He smiled faintly at the thought, though there was something wistful in it. "I think that's why I still notice the smell of certain things," he said. "Cold air, baking bread, wet leaves. They remind me of moments when life felt simple, even if everything else around it wasn't." It struck me how gently he spoke about his past, not glossing over the hard parts, but also not letting them erase the good ones. I spent summers at my grandparents' place by the lake, I offered in return, the memories rising easily now. The mornings always started in the garden. My grandmother would hand me a small pair of clippers and tell me which flowers were ready to cut and which ones needed more time. I used to think she had some kind of magic sense. Now I realize she just paid very close attention. I smiled at the memory. The days there moved at a different speed. We'd sit on the dock and listen to birds for what felt like hours. I don't remember anything especially dramatic happening, just a steady, peaceful kind of happiness. He looked at me, an understanding warmth in his gaze. It's funny, he said, how the older we get, the more it's those kinds of memories that stand out. Not the awards, not the promotions, just the quiet afternoons on docks and the smells from kitchens. I think they're the moments where we actually felt present, I replied, where there was nothing to perform, nothing to prove. He paused, considering that, then nodded. I don't usually talk about my past, he admitted softly after a moment, even with friends. I'm not sure why it feels different with you. Maybe because you actually listen, or maybe because this house reminds me of something I thought I'd outgrown. The honesty in his voice was calm, not dramatic, but it still landed with a small impact in my chest. I'm glad you feel you can, I said. I don't take that lightly. There was a stillness that settled over the table then, not empty, not tense, just a mutual recognition that something unspoken had been quietly acknowledged. By the time Daniel returned, apologizing more than necessary for taking so long, the atmosphere had shifted in an almost imperceptible way. The paperwork continued. The decisions were made, signatures added. The practical tasks of the day resumed their rightful place. And yet, as we all eventually drifted toward the door to say goodbye, Adrian's eyes met mine with a quiet, grateful look that didn't need words. That evening, after the dishes were washed and the house had settled into its nighttime hush, I sat in the living room with a blanket draped over my lap, and the lamplight softening the corners of the room. I thought about honesty, about how rare it is for people to speak plainly about their inner lives, and how easily our days can pass in a blur of surface-level exchanges. We talk about the weather, about traffic, about tasks, but beneath all that, most of us are carrying stories we rarely share. Weeks passed. Adrian visited again here and there, always for business, always with a clear purpose. And yet, each time there seemed to be a small part of the visit that drifted toward something more human than contracts and deadlines. Sometimes it was just a simple comment about how the light fell across the yard. Sometimes it was a brief memory about his travels, or a thoughtful question about my life beyond the dishes and the gardening and the quiet routines. Then, one weekend, Daniel had to leave town for a conference. It was early Saturday morning when he left, the sky still pale and the streets mostly empty. I walked him to the door, hugged him, watched him drive away, and stood on the porch for a moment longer than necessary. The house behind me felt unusually quiet. Not lonely, exactly. Just still. I made a cup of coffee, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and settled on the front steps. The neighborhood was waking up slowly. Distant dogs barking, a car starting somewhere, the faint clipping of someone's hedge trimmer, the kind of ordinary soundtrack you don't notice until you're alone with it. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. For a moment, I wondered if Daniel had forgotten something and turned back. But when I opened the door, there was Adrian, standing on the porch with a small paper bag in his hands and a slightly sheepish look on his face. I was in the area, he said, offering a faint smile, and there's this bakery that makes fresh loaves on Saturdays. I thought you might appreciate one, and well, Daniel mentioned he'd be away this weekend, so... He trailed off as if second-guessing himself. That's very kind, I said, genuinely touched. Please come in. I was just sitting with coffee. We can share some while it's still warm. We moved to the living room and I sliced the bread, letting the smell fill the room. It was simple, crisp on the outside, soft on the inside, but somehow felt like more than just food. It felt like a quiet gesture of care. We started with small talk, the usual, the conference, the weather, a strange story in the news. But as the minutes stretched, something more thoughtful surfaced. I've been thinking a lot lately, he said, looking down at the slice of bread in his hands, but not really seeing it. About how much of ourselves we keep hidden, even from the people we're close to. I listened, my hands wrapped around my mug. In business, he continued, you're expected to project confidence, stability, you're supposed to be unfazed. It's like putting on armor every morning, but the older I get, the more I realize how exhausting that can be, and how lonely. His voice wasn't bitter, just honest. You'd think being honest would be the simplest thing in the world, he said, but it's not. Not the kind of honesty that says, I'm tired, or I'm scared, or I don't always know what I'm doing. People say they want authenticity, but they're not always sure what to do with it when they see it. I nodded, feeling his words sink into my own experiences. I think we all have versions of ourselves we rotate through, I replied. There's the one we use with family, the one we wear at work, the one we bring to social events. We adjust, we smooth edges, we downplay certain feelings because we don't want to inconvenience anyone. And then, late at night, when everything is quiet, the real questions finally knock on the door. He let out a quiet breath that was half a laugh, half something else. Exactly, he said. You start wondering which version of you is actually the real one, or if they all are, just in different proportions. We fell into a longer conversation, weaving through thoughts about identity and expectations, about the way childhood shapes our understanding of strength and vulnerability. He spoke about times he'd wanted to say something honest in a meeting but didn't, afraid it would be seen as weakness. I spoke about evenings when I'd felt unreasonably sad for no obvious reason, then scolded myself for it and buried it under chores and checklists. There were pauses, here and there, but none of them felt awkward. They were the kind of pauses where the heart catches up with the tongue, where you decide whether you're willing to keep going a little deeper. By late afternoon, the bread was nearly gone, and the light outside had shifted into the softer tones of early evening. Adrian looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders no longer carrying that faint, invisible tension. I'm grateful, he said quietly, for these conversations. I don't take them for granted. Neither do I replied. Not long after, Daniel came home from the conference, tired but energized in the way he always was after days of networking and presentations. That evening, the three of us had dinner together, one of those simple meals that somehow feels richer when there's an extra person at the table. There was laughter, there were stories, there was a gentle ease in the room that made everything feel a little more alive. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into a new kind of normal. Adrian visited from time to time, always for practical reasons. Documents, strategy sessions, planning for upcoming ventures. But the human moments threaded themselves quietly through the business. One late afternoon, I was in the garden clipping back some overgrown branches and coaxing the stubborn herbs into tidy lines. The sky was streaked with gentle pastels, the air cool but not cold. I heard a car door, then the muted murmur of voices, and a few minutes later Daniel poked his head out the back door to tell me Adrian had arrived. I wiped my hands on my jeans and joined them inside. Adrian noticed the faint traces of dirt on my wrists and fingers and smiled. "Garden day?" he asked. "Always, when the weather lets me," I said. It's one of the few places where I feel like time slows down just enough for me to catch my breath. Daniel was called to his office again, a conference call he couldn't delay. And suddenly it was just the two of us in the quiet of the house once more. I poured us each some tea, and we settled into the living room, the light spilling across the rug in long, stretched shapes. "Do you ever think about how certain people come into your life at the most unexpected times?" Adrian asked after a while. "More often lately," I replied, "especially in the last few months." He smiled gently. "I had a friend once," he said. "Someone I met at a job I only kept for a year. We weren't particularly close at first, but there was this one evening where we ended up being the last two people in the office. The power had gone out in half the building, and we were waiting for maintenance to figure it out. We started talking, really talking, not just about deadlines and deliverables. By the time the lights came back on, I realized I'd shared more with him in an hour than I had with some people I'd known for years. It didn't turn us into lifelong best friends or anything dramatic, but it stayed with me. The fact that In the middle of such an ordinary day, something quietly meaningful can happen. I understood that in a way I couldn't quite put into simple words. So much of life is like that, I said. We think the big planned moments are what transform us: graduations, weddings, new jobs. But it's often the unplanned conversations, the unexpected visits, the quiet afternoons that shift something inside us. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting over the room, as if taking in every detail, every small mark of living: a stack of books, a half-finished knitting project on the armchair, a pair of reading glasses left on the table. "I've realized," he said softly, "that I've spent a lot of my life waiting for the big moments, the ones that would tell me I'd finally arrived where I was supposed to be. But lately, I'm starting to think that maybe the point isn't to arrive at all. Maybe it's just to be fully present wherever we happen to be." Those words hovered in the air, simple and yet quietly profound. We sat with them for a while, both of us watching the shadows slowly lengthen across the floor. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that our connection wasn't built on drama or intensity. It had grown from small, consistent acts of presence: listening, sharing, noticing. Eventually, Daniel returned, and the evening shifted back into its familiar pattern. The three of us discussed upcoming plans, cracked jokes, commented on the strange behavior of the stock market. Underneath it all, there was that same soft, steady warmth, unspoken but felt. Time moved on, as it always does. Then, one evening, as autumn leaned into early winter, Daniel came home with a slightly different expression on his face. A thoughtful one, a little heavier than usual. "What is it?" I asked, setting down the dish towel I'd been using. He smiled, though it was tinged with something bittersweet. "Good news for Adrian," he said. "He's been offered a position out of state. A big one. More responsibility, better pay. It's the kind of offer you don't say no to."